Welcome to the Outskirts Film Podcast. My name is Christopher Small, and today I'm joined by my co-hosts.
Hi, I'm Alonso Aguilar.
Hi, I'm Öykü.
Today we also have a special guest joining us, Hannah Yang, curator of Doc Film Chicago's retrospective Boris Barnet, A Cinema Despite Life.
Hello.
We thought we'd take the occasion of this really exciting program appearing kind of miraculously on US soil to revisit the films of Boris Barnet, whom Outskirts listeners will know was the filmmaker and were the films collectively that were the impetus behind the printed magazine Outskirts, which was of course named for one of the Soviet director's greatest films, and whose first issue was dedicated to his work. In the introduction to the Doc Films retrospective, you wrote that Barnet, quote, conveys the beauty and tragedy of the everyday with an embodied grace that cannot help but linger on the presence of things. Fresh air, the lilt of a song, blinding waves, the illuminated white flowers at night. Barnet never much liked his films, but his love for the sensations and pleasures of cinema and life abounds in every frame. As we begin our discussion, which will surely touch on our shared history with this artist, I just wanted to ask you, Hannah, and also Öykü and Alonso, where you first encountered the films of Boris Barnet.
Yeah, so I had not really known about Barnet before I saw his films. When I was in Paris studying abroad in 2024, there was a large retrospective at the Cinémathèque Française. It was a pretty comprehensive retrospective, and unfortunately I could not make it out to all of the screenings, but I was there for the opening night screening of By the Bluest of Seas, and that was kind of a really important moment for me to see that film and to be introduced to this filmmaker who, you know, was very beloved by the French, and seeing it in Paris, I think, kind of gave me a context for who Barnet was. I went to a few other screenings during that retrospective, the one that stands out the most being Bountiful Summer. So By the Bluest of Seas introduced me to the filmmaker, but I think Bountiful Summer kind of confirmed to me that this was something that needed to be shown in the States as well. And we haven't had a Barnet retrospective or program in quite a while, so I was very excited to bring these to Chicago if possible.
And can you say what it was about those two films, both of which, I mean, each sort of stands as a different pole in Barnet's career. One kind of embodying this really lively, improvisatory magic of his early films, and then Bountiful Summer is this kind of ultimate Stalinist collective farm musical.
I think I found enough of a connection between both, and they come at such different, as you say, different periods of his work and his career. But I think surprise was maybe one of the first things that I felt watching By the Bluest of Seas. I think people kind of describe it as a Soviet miracle, like of cinema, because it really, there's nothing else like it. And then Bountiful Summer I was also quite surprised by, because it has the Stalinist facade, and it has kind of all of the makings of a Soviet film, a Stalinist film. It's so simple in ways, and it's really about other things. You can tell that Barnet is really interested in other things. Like I said, those small details of life, the physical presence. It's those things that I think, you know, I'm drawn to when I watch a film, but the way that Barnet brings them out is quite amazing.
I definitely want to dig into the actual work of the retrospective, but I also wanted to pass it to Öykü and Alonso, because I'm also curious. I'm actually sure I know the answer to this question, where you first encountered Barnet.
I initially read about Barnet because I saw like him being described like, as kind of like a distinctive like filmmaker within like the generalized idea of what Soviet cinema is. I think that bourgeois humanism was kind of like the general sense that was used, and I was like, interesting, because like despite loving like other like Soviet filmmakers from the time, like this kind of like a evocation of like lyricism isn't something that necessarily associated with him. And then I saw Outskirts the first time, and it kind of makes sense to me like why he was kind of this like figure that could exist within the framework of like Soviet cinema, but had like these leanings and this like kind of almost like uncomfortably within this range, and kind of like transcended in a way.
I think when you have filmmakers who are defined by a more radical or distinctive quality, I didn't know how to navigate in his filmography. Maybe that was a challenge. I just kind of started watching quite blindly, but I think I was really lucky to start by the Bluest of the Seas, because that film literally just took me in, and I was so overjoyed by being in that moment, in that presence with these people. It's just this really human presence that sometimes you feel more connected to characters than real human beings in the world. It's just this synergy, something they diffuse. They have this really strong presence, especially they're so vivid on the screen, the way they interact with, because we have these characters who are in love with the same woman, but who are also friends, and their emotions are so genuine, vivid, and heightened. It's just, you want to be part of that flow of energy within the screen. So I think if I had started, for instance, with Outskirts, I don't know if I would had felt the same, but I felt more connected and like embraced by the film. And that was a big joy.
Actually, it's interesting that you say that, because just before we were recording, I was talking with Hannah about your first films in this retrospective are By the Bluest of Seas and then the silent films. And I think it's interesting to think about watching his films chronologically, because when you begin, you get a different idea of Barnet than if you necessarily, were to just go by the most popular films on Letterboxd, for example. Because I think like House on Trubnaya, Girl with a Hat Box, also By the Bluest of Seas, Outskirts, they form a kind of coherence that I think could suggest that his whole career is like that. But then when you dig into the later films, the picture is murkier.
That was a big, I think, important part for me, was starting with By the Bluest of Seas. Because it's, of course, the first film that I encountered. But then when I showed it for the first time here, I realized it's the same kind of thing of to watch it with an audience. It is a film that kind of embraces you or kind of energizes the audience. And so once you see this, you're kind of, I think, you see the traces of it in other films as well.
Yeah, I think it's something with like physical presence. Their corporal presence is so strong. Both of the two male protagonists. I was just so amazed by how physically present they were on the screen. They just like, I don't want, like, they're not caricatural in that way, but it's just like he knows how to put their energy forward. It's really abstract. I think it's only something you can talk about once you have the image of that movement.
Yeah, I think it's also quite distinctive from the usual, like, which I love, like the expressive, like, uncanniness of like Soviet acting from the 20s in particular, which is again like very in depth with like the silent cinema. And I guess Barnett almost immediately like creates his own kind of like actorial framework, which to me is very unique to him, which, as you were saying, has this like power and gravitas, which is almost like a transitional point between that like expressiveness and more like a naturalistic register. And to me, it's always that perhaps is something that keeps appearing throughout his career. One of the things that I find, despite like switching gears aesthetically,
there seemed to be like this kind of like a circuit through which various different traditions of cinema seem to just be powering through in a very intense way. And that this mix of traditions is very, very unusual. So like the first 15 minutes of By the Bluest of Seas is like that for me. Like the way that he shoots the waves in these kind of like long lenses where the waves seem to be swallowing the sun, and then these amazing seagulls, and it almost feels like this like underground experimental film, something like Dorsky or something, I don't know. And then suddenly these characters appear, and then it's like a McCary film, like this, like suddenly it's this kind of lively comedy, and then it becomes an amazing melodrama. And there's the moment when Yelena Kuzmina's necklace is ripped, and these beads or pearls, whatever she has, fall down and crash on the floor, and he captures it in slow motion, and it's like, there's not really a reason why that should be in slow motion. There's no narrative reason for it, and yet it's like one of those like just true moments of cinema that just kind of stays with you forever.
The thing you said about the waves is also, I think, true with The Girl with the Hat Box, because we have this film that is mostly a comedy of misunderstanding, especially in the second half. But there are these moments when they're traveling by train, they're walking around in the snow, that becomes really beautiful abstractions of the nature. And I think it feels like a film that is hidden within the actual film. And that's maybe true for many of his films, even in the later periods with Alyonka or The Whistle Stop. The shots of nature that kind of becomes bigger than what's going on in the film. It's just like a moment of sublime abstractions, let's say.
For me, part of the joy of Barnet and discovering Barnet at the time that I did was I was also kind of simultaneously watching a lot of Dvorsky films, and I think those films reminded me of Barnet, or certain moments in Barnet. And so when you said before, or what Boris Nalepo said of, had he been born in a different place, for me, I wonder at times if in a different time, in a different place, his cinema, his real interests are not similar to, those more experimental avant-garde films. I'm skipping ahead to like Pages of Life, which is, I think, 1948. This is what I mean by the illuminated white flowers at night. He has a shot in the night of a branch of white flowers, and then I think he gets closer, and then it's replaced by a face of a woman.
Like, I always think about like the more poetic filmmakers from this period, because often when you kind of study their life, there's no reason for them to be poetic in that way. Like, I mean, Barnet has one of those great silent film director biographies. Barnet enlisted in the Red Army. While he was in the Red Army, he joined kind of late in the Civil War. He got cholera, came back, and then after recovering became a boxer, and then was somehow, I think, a stunt double involved in the kind of practical side of filmmaking, then became an actor, then very quickly became a director, and his first assignment was Miss Mend, this kind of epic serial. So it's never clear to me, like, from where this kind of highly sensitive poetic sensibility came from in his life. But it's there from the beginning. The opening of House on Trubnaya, when she's walking in the streets of Moscow looking for somewhere to go. But the opening shot is this puddle. And it's like there's ducks, right? And you just see the puddle and it's like reflecting the red square, if I remember correctly. And then suddenly someone comes and it gets... like they step in the puddle and it gets blurry, or the ducks walk into the puddle, and it's one of those moments in Barnet that, in this case, at the very start of the film, seems to kind of open it up to any kind of possibility.
Yeah, the opening of that film is really funny. Actually, we have this mostly close-up shots of people living on the same house in different floors. So you have this really messy place where people are trying to wake up. It's just like throwing you in that neighborhood, in that place, and you just have to navigate what's going on. So when you first encounter the character who comes to Moscow to find her uncle, you're kind of in the same position as her, because the energy of the film is just too overwhelming, and you, while watching it, I think you kind of share the same experience with her.
Maybe I'll just take this opportunity to speak about the magazine, because it's a bit of a white elephant in any discussion of Barnet on the Outskirts Film podcast. We've mentioned a few times the other Boris Nalepo, Russian programmer. I think the story of the magazine and how it relates to Barnet is really closely tied to Boris. There was a retrospective at the Cinemateca Portuguesa in 2015, curated by Pierre Léon. Through that, I had discovered some of his films, Alyonka, I think most obviously, and By the Bluest of Seas. During the pandemic, Boris Nalepo was still living in Moscow, and he was going every day to a retrospective held at Kino Illusion, where they had done a near complete Barnet retrospective. So I was seeing Boris watching these movies that I had always wanted to see, posting in Facebook comments, and these huge Facebook threads kind of growing in discussion about Boris Barnet. And so then later that year, I started to watch more of his films, and I discovered that there were 8 or 9 Barnet films at the Czech National Film Archive here in Prague. And I was trying to get that to kind of come together, and it didn't come together, but Barnet never left me. And kind of concurrent to this, we were discussing the idea of starting a magazine, and therefore it became a kind of arranged marriage in some way.
Oh, I have a question. I guess why Outskirts? Just, is it your favorite Barnet film?
You know, when you're deciding to name a magazine, you go through so many variations of like truly terrible names. You know, from the beginning, we always wanted to be a kind of peripheral magazine, self-consciously styled as such. So Outskirts seemed to be this perfect moniker.
And also speaks to Barnet, I think, as a filmmaker, kind of as a peripheral filmmaker.
Yeah, which has also been something that we've taken up with this podcast, but also with the magazine. Is always we've always been drawn to filmmakers who are kind of damaged in some way, who history and circumstance was unforgiving, as has been mentioned a few times. The full quote of what Boris Nalipo had told me was that, for him it was a tragedy that Boris Barnet had been born in the Soviet Union. I never quite was sure if I really agreed with that, but in many ways it's true, because his impulses are not kind of the impulses that other great Soviet filmmakers had. And he was also in a very real way destroyed by the system, so to speak. And, even if we love his later films, we can see that they are very much influenced by a system that was like hostile to everything he was about.
I guess this can lead to the heresy of like, I could not like in Outskirts that much.
I didn't like. I give 3.5 stars. Come on, like you're just exaggerating and putting in me a really difficult position.
I think I'm actually more of an Outskirts skeptic than you.
I mean, it's Outskirts itself is a strange film, because it kind of sits in the middle of his like most cherished period, and also Outskirts is his first sound film, and as a result, I mean, I think it also, I guess it depends like on your mileage with those kind of early 30s sound films. I don't know if that's like how you feel about that. For me, this kind of stiffness and strangeness of films like that, particularly, I mean, even in By the Bluest Seas and in Outskirts, there are long periods where the sound almost completely disappears. That there's almost no background sound, which does give those movies like a very sort of strange stop-start feeling. But it also, I mean, it has a talking horse. I mean, what do you want?
Yeah, I guess like, I mean, I do like the film a lot. Just like as you mentioned, it seems to be, particularly since By the Blues of Seas comes 1 year afterwards, and it feels perhaps more ingrained in the kind of distinctiveness that kind of like made me gravitate towards him. Then I always seen like, I think every single film I've seen after Outskirts, I kind of found, and they've all been after that film, so I haven't really engaged with his like silent period. Yeah, perhaps that's the one I can associate like more in a clearer way to, as you were saying, that transitional period, or particularly like the mannerisms of like Soviet cinema, which I kind of see in Outskirts. There's like glimpses, particularly when there's like more of the communal aspect and the lighter tone that are perhaps what I like the most about like Barnet as a filmmaker. And it's I don't want to like disregard the film at all, because I think it's a great film. Which is like, interestingly, like in comparison to like his lighter work, even his less reputable work, particularly like the war sequences in the film are aesthetically interesting to me, but perhaps are not the Barnet I'm like looking for when I'm like watching By the Blues of Seas, or when I'm watching like particularly like Whistle Stop.
I hear what you're saying, but to me that film is really, really special on so many levels. And when I think about it, I think of maybe my favorite scene in any Barnet film, which is when the brothers are in the trench and a shell falls, and the brother pretends to be dead, and his brother starts sobbing, and as his brother is sobbing, he realizes that his brother's playing a trick on him. He comes back to life, and they all start laughing and making fun of this brother for sobbing about his dead sibling. And that moment is so strange, such a strange mix of tones, like so perverse and yet so joyful. And then, if I remember correctly, shortly afterwards, the brother dies for real. And again, like, I think it's only Barnet who could sustain that kind of transition of kind of emotional tones or emotional registers within one sort of flow.
I think the brother who was crying, actually, we found out that he dies in a letter to his father. And I think that to me made it even more perverse, perhaps, that the brother who's kind of been portrayed as the weaker one who followed his brother into war, we discover his death kind of in that way, and then he just stops appearing in the film. I thought it was slightly, I think there are moments, like some of his films are kind of made of just moments, and in between there are some, it's not nothing, but it's just there is a bit of a lag in Outskirts that I found interesting. That was why I prefer By the Bluest. But of course I don't need to pit the two against each other.
Коля! Николай! Колька! Чего тебе?
Do you guys see, actually I think Alonso's the only one who saw it, A Night in September, which is this moment when, like, the earlier Barnet that we've spoken a bit about starts to feel the iron grip of events in world history.
Yeah, I've seen that even at the time. I think Outskirts itself was kind of like, there was this constant in this period of like lack of ideological focus, and like I was saying earlier, like this mentions of like his bourgeois sensibilities and things like that, which I guess basically go to like the lighter community aspects, like the romance in the films and things like that. But yeah, it's interesting to see like A Night in September is the one that happens, at least in his chronology, like right after By the Blues of Seas, because might be like a very blatant like contrast, and this one I think was the first one he did with Mosfilm. The presentation is very much so like a Stalinist film. Basically deals with like the Stakhanovite movement, which is basically this like romanticized and mythological version of like the miner workers in the Soviet Union, that they were the ones that were more committed than anyone else to overwork themselves in like for the Soviet program. And the film is basically about that, of this creating this kind of like a national like hero character, Anton Mikhailovich Kulagin, which he's like this like pure Stakhanovite, and frames the rest of his like working troupe as this like reactionary like workers that want like bourgeois things like rest and doing like less arduous work. So he becomes this like almost like a martyr figure. But at the same time, I think the film, also I have to admit, I have like I don't know why I have like this bias towards like Soviet bloc minor films. Like one of my favorite films of all time is Coronel Wolf's Sunseekers, which is like this East German film also about like a uranium mine. I think just like the aesthetics of like monochrome black and white like mining procedures like shot in a Soviet style, to me it's just like, yeah, cinema was made for this specifically. And this film has a lot of that, yeah, which is kind of intersected with this high intensity melodrama, which doesn't have the kind of like free flowing lightness that you have like in the previous like 30s like Barnet films. But to me, occasionally, particularly as Ulrich was saying at the beginning, like the way he frames like actors and how like actors portray themselves in his films, to me, is still in there. Like it's not really a characteristic of like what, at least for what I've seen of like Soviet film this period. So I can see like Barnet in there at the same time, and also perhaps this one is more. I see it as of particular interest because his Soviet formalism. Perhaps in this one it's even clearer and put to the forefront. So I can totally see why this one is like one of his like more like critically reviled films, because it is like almost like outright Stalinist in this whole construction, and it does have like a lesser like intent perhaps in the way like people approach Barnett and read what they're interested in him, which is kind of like ironic given like to me Outskirts also doesn't really fully have that to me. But in this case, I guess being on the counterpart of that, to the extent that it becomes this like tension you can almost see within the film, it does feel a lot like as a commission film. So those moments that arise occasionally, particularly when in the more like melodramatic sequences, particularly the relationship of this like idyllic worker with his father, to me, those moments of joy, almost like forceful moments of joy within this like very rigid structure, are magical to me in this film.
The things that really stand out to me are exactly what you said at the start. That it almost has this kind of cartoonish, like pictorial quality to these mining scenes, like this like strange, epic, artificial plasticity that's like really. It's a really weird intruder into the Barnett universe, but then you come to see that it becomes one of the dominant features of those later films. It's also maybe why this film, which I think I'm the only one who saw The Old Jockey, you'll see it always be described as this kind of very minor film, you know, it's because it's like this countryside comedy essentially about a jockey and his daughter and what happens when the jockey gets too old and so on and so on. To me, it's a really fascinating film precisely for the fact that it like shows Barnett like this kind of indefatigable spirit of Barnett, that he, like, no matter what the circumstances of the world were, no matter what the film he was making, there was always a way for him to struggle to express this kind of spontaneity of life. When you see it, it's just like you see how the structure of this film, even though it's different to those early Silents, the structure of the film, like those films, follows like a river. It seems to be sort of totally free-flowing from one scene to the other. I guess it goes to the scroll idea, right? That you just feel like the film can go in any direction, built by the energies of one scene into the other, into the other, into the other. This film like has this kind of like French quality in the sense that it's a bit like a Renoir film or like a Marcel Pagnol, like things flowing, spontaneity of life, etc. But also in this film and in all these early Barnett films, you can see just such a huge American influence on his films. Like the whole conception of gag comedy in Barnett, like the whole way that he builds up a joke and then has like the punchline in physical comedy, is extremely American. Night in September and The Old Jockey were made before the Soviet Union went to war with Nazi Germany. But when they did, Barnett became a wartime filmmaker. He made two very, very interesting wartime shorts, as well as the film A Good Lad. Okay, do you want to talk about Dark is the Night?
When I watched it, I always kept comparing to Outskirts, because I think even though those are like both wartime pictures, there's still the humanity or hope or the slice of life aspect is still more present in Outskirts, whereas here this is a very dark film, and I think one of the scenes that I couldn't forget is the Russian soldier shooting the man and his kid after the confrontation in this circus, because they want people to not to hide the wounded soldiers and collaborate with the local government, because there's the Germans after the German invasion. But the man they choose, he's an intellectual. He tells the crowd not to give the wounded, to defend and resist. So it creates a whole havoc in the circus, and at the end, the soldier basically shoots the kid. I mean, her face is hidden, but that's it's like, I think, the most anti-Barnet moment from the films I've seen so far, and that was a bit like the wow for me. It's not that shocking. I mean, it's not that shocking because we don't see her face and everything, but it's just the fact that it's there, present, was interesting.
Isn't it the case that Boris Barnet himself plays the bad guy in that film?
Yeah, I think he plays the Nazi commander.
Yeah, he plays the German commander, Colonel Belts. That's an interesting place that we can spring off from Dark is the Night, which is also Boris Barnet's kind of strange and illustrious career as an actor. I mean, he started in this incredible Lev Kuleshov film called The Extraordinary Adventures of Mr. West in the Land of the Bolsheviks. And he also acts in Miss Mend. He has an amazing cameo in House in Trubnaya. To go back to these later films, Dark is the Night, and then The Scout's Exploit, aka The Secret Agent, a couple of years later, Barnet plays Nazis. He plays them in this very kind of understated and almost suave way, particularly in The Scout's Exploit. To bring it back also to The Silence, to me that film is like an amazing example of Barnet's skill with space. You know, when he wanted to limit himself to indoor spaces. One of the things I remember so clearly about Dark is the Night is that attic that she's hiding everybody in, and the way that there's this board that crosses the two divisions in the room, right, that people have to cross. And when I think about those early films as well, like Girl with Hatbox, House on Trubnaya, there's like these interior scenes are so amazing, you know, not only because of these like craggly old Soviet faces that you see, but just like the layout of the room, like this desolate rooms where you can see the dust somehow. Because I'm also curious, Hannah, like since you've seen Pages of Life, which is one of the Bonnets I haven't seen, and remains this kind of object of curiosity, because also it's the beginning of what you could crudely call his Stalinist period, let's say, as it's also this like very kind of compromised film in some sense. But maybe you can tell us a bit about it.
Pages of Life is definitely a minor film. You can sense the Stalinist forces in it because it is very clearly just propaganda. It's about a woman who kind of innovates and is able to, I think, just increase production or something like that in a factory. It's very standard. For me, at least, I don't recall much from it except for those absolutely beautiful shots, these poetic shots. And I think it's kind of like it's almost as if he concentrated all of his, you know, artistic sensibilities into just that one shot, and kind of the rest of the film was made for other purposes. So I think it's fascinating in that sense, and I wonder if the other ones are. I really don't think the other ones are as much like this. Obviously, Alyonka and Bountiful Summer have much more going on. Pages of Life is an interesting one, I think, for how much it is perhaps not interesting in other ways.
This really does mark that period of Barnet's career that is kind of like the troubled period that I think kind of generations of film critics and film historians have tried to grapple with. I mean, in some cases, it's very explicitly propagandistic, as you said, like Pages of Life, and particularly Generous Summer, which ends with this beautiful party under a huge portrait of Stalin, are very kind of explicit in that way. But I mean, there's also kind of an aesthetic shift at this point in Barnet's sensibilities, where he had to kind of contend with a different kind of filmmaking. Most actually, obviously, he had to learn how to film in color, of which I think Generous Summer is the first, or Bountiful Summer is the first major example of that. And I mean, that to me, that's also one of my favorites, especially as a compromised object. Actually, there's something really, really beautiful and perverse about this kind of, I mean, the craziest of genres, the collective farm musical.
Watching Bountiful Summer was really strange. Like, it was a strange experience because you're really swept away in the beauty of, the farms and the fields and the people and the singing and the romance. And that last portion when it kind of you see the portrait of Stalin, it really does turn the entire experience around. But
it kind of ruins the mood a little bit when there's a giant portrait of Stalin.
Yeah, it was pretty yeah.
I haven't seen it. I'm curious. How did you compare to House on Trubnaya? That's also a quite propagandist film about unions.
I mean,
no?
I guess there's like the obvious difference would be that in Bountiful Summer, it's and I guess Pages of Life, it's like much more explicit, and also the plot is very kind of just fundamentally Stalinist, because also his last silent film, The Thaw, is also kind of propagandistic in some way, but in those earlier films it's something lighter. It's something that Barnet is able to kind of find his way around, let's say, whereas I think what makes Bountiful Summer so beautiful and so strange is the fact that it really is a Stalinist film. I mean, there's no way around it. There's no subtlety there, but like Barnet is able to somehow embody it and turn it into this kind of ultimate perverse musical somehow.
No, I agree. And it's also, I think, a little different because the romance and the comedy, to me, it almost felt like it was underlying the film rather than kind of fully coming up, but it's just like fully saturated with propaganda in a way that I think, House on Trubnaya, he's able to, I think, have more of a sensibility there, like a voice there, and how he says things.
Yeah, and I think like for the next few years, if you read the plots of Barnet's films, you can kind of see what he was having to work with. I mean, Pages of Life is about this female engineer who goes to her hometown to help the construction of a power plant. There was a concert film that Barnet directed at this time called Masters of Ukrainian Art in Concert, which is this kind of it's a musical review. Liana is about Moldavan folk musicians competing for a prize. The poet is about a local poet who helps the communists in Odessa somehow through his poetry. And Bountiful Summer, of course, is about like crop yields. Have you guys seen The Wrestler and the Clown?
I saw like a slightly faded soft color print of it at the Cinematheque. Without the subtitles, it really is just some kind of like dreamscape, because it's set at the turn of the century and it's kind of not placed in any of the other Barnet settings. And the characters are quite interesting. It's a circus, so it was really fascinating.
That sounds just like a film for me, but yeah.
Yeah, that's really an Alonso film. It actually has this plot device that apparently was something that Barnet himself in his pre-directorial life did, which is that, it's set in a circus and the wrestler sits in the stands, like among the audience, and then he's challenged, like the guy in the ring challenges the whole audience to a fight, and then this guy has to pretend to be a member of public and then beat up the guy in the ring, like for audience's amusement. And Barnet used to do that. He used to be the guy who would sit in the stands and would get called down to beat people up. So
they call that plant in wrestling.
He was the John Cena of the Soviet.
So, more like Santino Marina, if you want to be like wrestling actor.
I don't have the reference.
I mean, The Wrestler and the Clown was a Barnet film that I know for the French Cahiers people was incredibly important. I always wonder also how much that was affected by like the availability of certain prints. But if I remember correctly, Barnet went to France around that time and was like quite amazed by what people had to say to him and how much they seemed to like his films. And that's also actually an element of The Wrestler and the Clown, is that there's like a French element where the French are very interested in this wrestler and so on.
Yeah, I read about the film, and actually, from what I've seen, most of the references I've seen are kind of like comparisons or like some allusions to like American films. So there's, from what I read, there's like naturally Lubitsch, I think we mentioned earlier, but in this case they mentioned Roald Walsh. There's like reference to like the swashbuckling films of like with Errol Flynn. So I do like, just like the way this film has been discussed seems to be very much so in like the Kaya way of doing that, like in that time, just like contextualizing everything from this like authorial track. So yeah, to me that's interesting in this film in particular, because just like by the facade of it seems to be like very distinct from like this like Stalinist period in some ways.
What I guess makes Barnet a little different than the other filmmakers that we've talked about on this podcast is that, like, yeah, he did have this redemption at the end somehow, like critically speaking. So a lot of the filmmakers we've looked at, they made their poet or their pages of life, and then they stayed there. Whereas with Barnet, like in his last years, like he was able to make films again that people still love. Maybe I'll also just pause at this point and ask Hannah, like, how was it to actually make this retrospective in terms of prints, digital files? Like, where were you getting those materials from, and how have they been to see them?
I thought the retrospective would be possible given the Cinémathèque Française's showing of the Austrian Film Museum prints. And so that's where I kind of solidified the program, because a lot of these prints ended up having English subtitles. I went in kind of assuming I'd have to piece together things and watch these films in the way that the French people had watched them, largely without subtitles, because I think with Barnet you can kind of get away with that and still have a really nice time. But these Austrian Film Museum prints had subtitles. They were very generous in loaning them to us. The quality is great. You know, the colors are really stunning in the color prints. And so those kind of formed the core part of the program. And then I figured this is maybe the only chance we get to show as many Barnet films as possible. Because it is really like, you know, if you show these larger films, great, but he has so many other works and they wouldn't be shown kind of outside of the context of a retrospective, perhaps. A lot of these other films are digital, and it's actually been harder to get those films. So it's a really interesting, you know, it's certainly one of the more ambitious programs that I've had to do. It requires a lot of coordination. If I may bring up the symposium that we're also doing at the end of this retrospective, organized by Maria Belidrovskaya, who actually introduced me to Barnet. It'll be held at the University of Chicago. We're inviting a few scholars, some really great Soviet film historians and scholars, including Bernard Eisenschitz from Paris. Yeah, so I'm just excited to kind of, I think we're trying to do this program as a kind of intervention and say, this filmmaker is worth thinking about and including in the conversation of other filmmakers. Presents a case of him being a real anomaly in Soviet cinema.
Отказ чемпиона России продолжать борьбу засчитывается ему как поражение.
We can definitely get onto Whistle Stop, but I think Alyonka is this kind of
rejuvenating force, maybe in his
and
film.
I know for a lot of our tourists critics as well, like that's the ultimate Barnet film in a way.
It's really so beautiful. But when you said like because you mentioned French filmmakers, I thought about Jean Vigo a lot while watching it, especially the scenes where Alyonka is interacting with her teacher. That is just pure, like, this whimsy character made me think of Zéro de Conduite or a bit of Ozu as well. I mean, these are just really freewheeling references that are maybe not necessarily related to his own influences, but I felt that it's an energy that he, as if he found it again in that.
Yeah, in the interview that we did in Outskirts, Pierre Léon compared it directly to Ozu, in the sense that it's about this kid who's kind of this monster, like trampling over the narrative like Godzilla, and like it's the same kind of like benevolent evilness of children that you see in Ozu's films, that they have the little world, and in that world they are the dictators. And those scenes with Vitaminic, the teacher, are like so good. And also like something I had forgotten is just how much Barnet plays with fast motion. So it's the same way as like the beats dropping in By the Bluest of Seas. Here it's like he speeds it up, he slows it down, like depending on like the effect that he wants to put over. So like there's still like that Barnet is still very much there. Of course, it's like filtered through this very kind of strange production at the same time.
And I think it's also like a formal return. It's like a retour à la source, because when you think of House on Trubnaya, the narrative device of flashback is, this film is basically consists of flashbacks. So it's more like I think it's more embedded to the story itself. People just remember things, or it's part of their story. Like it's embedded to the action, to the present of the action. But I think it's also something he goes back in his early work in that way too.
The reason that the film is set in Kazakhstan is because it takes place in a very kind of different, like post-Stalinist era. The film was made in 1961, but it's set in 1955. And the reason is because it's set during Khrushchev's Virgin Lands campaign, where Soviet citizens from the cities would volunteer to go to places like Kazakhstan, to the steppe, and try to increase wheat production. And which is also interesting because by 1961 it was kind of a failure, like environmentally catastrophic. So it's interesting that the film is set 6 years before, where these people are full of optimism about what they're gonna do. But you know, I think that's really sidelined in the film. Like the film is really just this kind of pure gust of invention in just one scene after another.
But I don't really agree with you. I think it's kind of highlighted through the dentist's story, because she goes there with full of hopes to work as a dentist and help the people, and she's confronted with this reality of a community that is totally different than what she expected. I mean, it's just one part of the story, but I think it's quite highlighted in that way.
But there's also like there's still that kind of spirit of invention that you was talking about earlier, Urku, with like the spontaneity of characters, affect, and like just the joy of seeing people move through space. But it is, it's a film that is much more controlled formally, like lots of wide shots, lots of like careful movements of the camera. Often like some of the kind of deep focus compositions in this film are really making me kind of gasp. Like something's happening in the extreme foreground, and in the background a window blows open and the sandstorm begins and blows the curtains open.
Experience with Barnet, I jumped straight from like A Night in September to Whistle Stop, so I basically there's like a big gap in the middle, although it kind of makes sense in a way. Like I miss that transitional period where there seems to be like a resurgence of these lighter elements that you mentioned, which I think Whistle Stop just immediately puts forward tonally. I think the first thing, like just like the initial like animation sequence to me was like immediately blowing my mind. that basically we see this like old character in animation, just like walking, very like bare bones animation, black and white. This transition from that, like from the briefcase he's carrying straight to like the actual footage of the film, made me think of like M. Night Shyamalan sequence in like The Happening, when we see like a lot of people being followed through like a gun that he's using. So yeah, there's that kind of like magical element to what he's putting forward. And then the film itself, to me, has that collective element that we discussed in the Hysteria period, which basically has this excuse of this old character artist, Pavel Pavlovich, who basically spends his vacation in like a collective farm in like a picturesque like village, and it's mostly just like an excuse to have like this choral construction of like scenes of daily life, of these like wondrous moments. And it's even more detached from directed sense of like a political urgency or like a social political context that happened in the 30s. And from what I read in like actually on the Outskirts piece Boris wrote, there seems to be like some tension with how that film, particularly in like in the Soviet Union, was received because of that. That minor element of like being once again too detached from the socialist realism of like you have to frame like reality. You're just like seeing people like dancing and like having their own like side adventures and things like that, which to me is all naturally the heart of the film, because it's all framed from this perspective of this like old character like coming there and just like reigniting his joy of life by seeing almost like a transition period from like the post-war like Soviet Union. And there's a lot of like almost also like in Boris' piece like reflections on what that meant for the Soviet Union at that moment in time, but also about like Barnet himself as a filmmaker doing like the last film of his career. A lot of projections like this old character, this old artist like coming back once again, reigniting that communal joy of just like framing sequences like are literally have like no plot or like narrative like justification. Just like I think a lot of like the dancing sequence when we see this like seduction process in that, and it's sort of like an extended sequence of like just a musical joy, and just like the way he frames like people dancing and moving. It's almost like to me at least like redirecting that like Stalinist sense of like collective joy that is very constrained in films like *A Night in September*, which almost like the staginess of that like socialist realism of like celebration and this like very institutional top-down way. Here to me it's kind of reframed to these more like intimate settings, or more like emergent like spaces.
Yeah, I agree with you. They are not there to serve a purpose. They're just part of a daily life of these characters, and that's a really interesting and I think masterful thing that he does there. Such an eventful setting coming together to form this more like a fresco of daily life, maybe we can say. And there are some really small not conflicts, even just like micro events that happen, but it's just something that is part of life. I don't want to go as further to say as naturalistic, but it's just you I think while you're watching the film, he manages to allow us to inhabit that space with these characters, not as just like this symbols or figures, abstract figures that represent ideals, but really you are invited to be part of that community and their daily lives, as this character Pavel Pavlovich comes to do it as a painter. And I mean, maybe painter is also a interesting I don't know if it's an allegorical he doesn't have an allegorical presence, but as an observer he kind of mirrors our presence there too, I think. And I thought about Tati when I saw the opening sequence, but also, I mean, he's definitely not as distinctive as Monsieur Hulot, but him being his mannerisms, his insistence on smoking indoors, or people's the way people try to treat and accept him as he is, not necessarily like contradict him what he's doing, that's also a really mellow way of creating daily dynamics in within their relations.
Yeah, to me it's kind of insane, and this actually goes back to perhaps our previous episodes when we have this moment of like acknowledging this moment we think as like, oh yeah, it's like pure authorial intent, and then you read about the production of this film and all the notes are about like, oh yeah, he was like half-heartedly doing this film. It's kind of like a studio, like work imposed by the studio, which to me is kind of insane, seeing what the film actually is, but seems to be the case.
Yeah, they're still available online at Movie Notebook, Boris Nalepo's very, very long investigation of the film, for which he researched a lot of the different materials that were available for the script of Whistle Stop, and was able to discover some very interesting new facts about the production of that film. Actually, I think one of the greatest honors that we had with Outskirts was that when Bernhard Eisenschitz was working on his Barnet book, he said that he wrote the chapter on Whistle Stop, and then Outskirts came out and he read Boris's piece and he threw away what he wrote and started it again. So that's one of those ultimate moments of recognition. I mean, I was just looking at Boris's piece, and there's something that I think speaks to what we've been discussing in this episode. He says, Whistle Stop is a humorous retelling of Barnet's own life, his tragic misalignment with time and space. His peer, Friedrich Elmler, was born at exactly the right time and in the right place and fit right in with history, since he was making art of a religiously ardent, convulsive Stalinism. Barnet, meanwhile, was meant for a different country and a different cinema, which he hardly had a chance to be making at any point after By the Bluest of Seas. Films that were truly his own were born out of rare moments of freedom when the state wasn't paying much attention to art. Had Destiny had other plans, it would be easy to imagine a Barnet in Hollywood giving Billy Wilder a run for his money.
Кто это тебя так?
Оступился. А ты чего прохлаждаешься-то? Что зерно не возишь? Ну ты не опасайся. Я за Клавкой погляжу, как за своей.
Ты что, еще раз оступиться хочешь?
Hannah, do you want to shout out some of the films in the program that are coming up?
A Good Lad will be February 11th, and we're showing those with the 2 wartime shorts. We're showing a print of The Wrestler and the Clown the week after that, and then Secret Agent the week after. And then we're doing a kind of, because of the symposium, and we're showing a couple films in the symposium, we're actually skipping ahead to Whistle Stop, his last film, and then showing, as part of the symposium, The Thaw, Dark as the Night, Alyonka, and Bountiful Summer. And I think I just wanted to end with Bountiful Summer because it was such a big film for me, but also because I think the pairing will be interesting. And I think just to comment on what we were saying before about this redemption for Barnet at the end of his career, I do think it's interesting that he died before continuing to make more films in a more perhaps compromised manner. From what I've read, it seems as if his suicide was also closely connected with his career, his filmmaking career, and where he was at the time. So it's just an interesting thing to think about.
Thank you, Hannah, for joining us for this episode. Now we are going to pivot and talk about some new films, as always. Oku, do you want to go first?
I watched Nostra Tierra by Lucrecia Martel recently, and I'm so glad that I rewatched it because that film I saw in Venice, and you were there, Christopher. It's such a hectic, crazy festival, and when I watched it again, I was like, I don't remember anything about this film. I didn't remember anything. I was so tired while watching it. I guess now it was such a the way I watched it right now, it felt really fulfilling because I was fully alert and taking notes, and I managed to notice the soundscape and how she built this whole investigation through reverse shot, but through the sound itself, because it's a film about a community whose member is killed by these people who claim to have the property of the land, and the autochthone people try to stop them by appealing to the law. And through this confrontation, one of these their members is killed, and the film basically follows the whole legal procedure. But the film opens such a interesting space through the use of historical documents, especially photographs, through drone shots, that we see this landscape distorted, taking different shapes than it is seen from the human eye, as if she's trying to understand not the truth, but the different perspectives that these land is can be read, can be thought. And while watching it, this is for the second time, I realized that she did such an amazing job with the sound, because it's so evocative, the way she intertwines the images through the sound that kind of evokes that moment where characters remembers a particular moment in their past. I was really impressed, and I'm really glad that I watched it again. It's amazing.
Yeah, those drone shots in that film are so amazing. I mean, I don't know of anyone who used drones so well. It's interesting. I actually, like, not to be this like pathological like maker of connections, but there is. I was thinking about Alyonka, the opening of Alyonka, where it's like the camera is like flying over these trucks in the Kazakh steppe, right in the very first image, and it just goes on and on and on and on, and like the image becomes strange and unreal because of how long it goes on, because that kind of helicopter style shot of trucks is very familiar, but the fact that Barnet keeps it going just turns like the very land into something strange. And that's what they do with the drones in Nuestra Tierra. Like this, the land becomes like deeply unfamiliar and deeply strange, even though you can see more of it than you normally would.
Yeah, it makes you dizzy while watching it. I think it just like your the way you perceive a normal image, it becomes really distorted. And then that bird scene, I think obviously it wasn't intentional, but I think that was also a peak moment in the film, because the way I think human eye through its devices try to conquer the land is that shocking moment where the drone is hit by a bird. Reminds you that no, actually there are other non-human perspectives that inhabit that land, and that's also part of it. And it's just like a reality shock kind of moment. Yeah.
Alonso?
No, I mean, I'm quite intrigued by this film. Although I have to admit, I didn't like the last two short things Lucrecia Martel has done, like Terminal Norte and Caminera de Piso. So I was kind of like, I had a little bit of a skepticism going to Nuestra Tierra, which I haven't seen yet. Although from your description, it does sound like a lot of like the elements that I particularly enjoy from Sama, which I think is her best film. Particularly the overall construction of the film, that sense of like strangeness and like displacement, is also in this film in another way. So yeah, I'll be looking forward to watch it, actually.
No, but how about you? What did you see?
What's your pick?
I was working on kind of like curatorial program around United Fruit Company commissioned educational films. And for those that don't know, the United Fruit Company is basically the root of all evil in Central America. It was like an American enclave that was created throughout the whole Atlantic region of like Central America. It had its own rules. It like overthrew governments. Any political power that wanted to tax it in some way was essentially like overthrown immediately. And they had their own film commission unit, which actually was, I don't want to rant too much about this. It was related to what eventually became like the OEA, which is like the International Organization of American States, which essentially was at some point just outright like anti-communist like organization working to support democracy in Latin America. The thing is, like, they commissioned some films which are very funny to watch because they're like done in this almost like ethnographic way. Of like they're framing objectively, they're using the newsreel footage, like the newsreel voiceover format, and using like a lot of journalistic instances from the 30s, but then describing the joyful horizontal trade and the benefits of like Central American nations dealing with the U.S. So you see a lot of like euphemistic shots of like, see this happy worker, he's carrying 2 tons of bananas, but you in the US, you have to be grateful of him because he enjoys this and he's part of this like reivindication of the worker, and this sense of otherness that's constructed in the film also visually is kind of what I'm like writing about. Because then in Central America later on, the whole, again, I don't want to rant too much about this because I literally wrote like 20,000 words about this. But basically the whole moment in the 70s, which hasn't really been explored that much, of like anti-imperialist sentiment in Central America, came as a reaction to the only images we had of our region being from this kind of like industrial commission films. So in Costa Rica in 1976, there was a film that also saw, again, which is one of my favorite films ever done in Central America, called Costa Rica Banana Republic, which is a parody of this kind of like like United Fruit Company commission films. So it's playing again with this like educational voiceover and like using a map and framing like, oh yeah, this country, then their production goes straight to the US. But it's also in a playful manner and has like sock puppets and has like outrageous like white Costa Ricans playing as like evil like entrepreneurs from the US. So yeah, like that dichotomy between the commissioned industrial film from the 30s then turning in some way to inform the like militant film in the 70s. That's what I've been mostly watching, and yeah, I think that's it. That's enough for now.
I watched recently, probably the best film that I've seen recently is Robert Butler's Night of the Juggler, which is, I don't know if you've heard about this film because it's got a kind of revival the last few months in particular, or the last year in particular, because it was long unavailable and it was just restored in 4K. But it's also one of those films that seems like it was cooked up in a lab specifically for me. It was made in 1980 and it stars James Brolin as this father whose kid is accidentally kidnapped, which is to say that the kidnapper mistakes his kid for a kid of a tycoon. But to describe the plot of this film seems a bit besides the point because it's one of the most kind of in the moment films I think I've ever seen, because at the moment that the kid is kidnapped begins like a 20-minute foot and car chase that is kind of unbelievable. Because James Brolin is very, very handsome, has beautiful hair, is wearing a plaid shirt open very much down almost to his waist, and is running. He's chasing the car that the kid was kidnapped in, and then he grabs onto the car knocks him off, he gets into another car, and so on and so on. And this like kind of insane momentum in the film, this relentlessness never really stops. And of course, like any kind of cheap New York film made in 1980, you see amazing things. You see amazing faces, you see strip clubs, underground peep shows, nasty streets, the side characters, very chewed up, surly side characters are played by all the guys you want to play those roles with those like faces that only in 70s and early 80s cinema you would see in New York films. And there was also just a kind of weird synchronicity with me watching it. I put it on at random. Just as I was finishing, I was on the last 100 pages of Robert Caro's The Power Broker, which is this 1,200 page book about the municipal history of New York and this man, Robert Moses, who demolished slums and so on. And so it's my surprise that when I was like explicitly trying to take a break from this book, I put this random film on, and it's about that the reason the guy kidnaps the kid is because he thinks it's the kid of the person who was doing slum clearance and destroyed his neighborhood, which he attributes to like with very racist ideas of black people and Puerto Ricans destroying his neighborhood. But it was this kind of just this beautiful like synchronicity of the universe to see that film. So yeah, I really highly recommend it, because until a couple of years ago, the only way you could see it was a kind of VHS scan, and now it's this beautiful 4K where you can see all the pockmarks on the men's faces and the
that's my favorite genre of film, like films with ugly men.
Yeah, there's a lot of ugly men in this film, and then there's James Brolin in the lead role, who's incredibly handsome. So It has everything. And it has one of the great titles, Night of the Juggler, even though it has nothing, like there's no juggling in the film. And it's also not set at night.
Right.
So thank you so much for listening to this Boris Barnet themed episode of the Outskirts Film Podcast. If you have any questions, feedback, complaints, observations, whatever, you can send them to us at Outskirts Film Magazine @gmail.com. And next week on the podcast, we will be talking about none other than Coffin Joe, aka Ze Dikaj Show.